Welcome to Let's Talk Leadership on Friday, the 16th of July. We're being joined this morning, because we're doing this UK time today rather than American time the other week. We're being joined by, I'm going to call them three friends and colleagues, because they are in different ways, but people who haven't been on the conversation with us before. So joining us today, first of all, is Jane Craigie, who is phoning in from the northeast of Scotland in glorious sunny weather. And we'll find out a bit more about what Jane does, but broadly speaking in the field of agri-journalism, but also importantly in helping to run something called the Rural Youth Project, which looks at the challenges that young people face living in rural areas. Saffy Connolly, who's with us, she's the Chief Operating Officer of MDS Limited, which is a not-for-profit, which has successfully for many, many years been running a huge postgraduate program for the UK fresh produce and food industry. But in fact, it has European connections as well. And then Jim Hick, who is based in France, but is calling in from Edinburgh, I think it is today. So we've got a Scottish flavour to this as well. Jim is a long-time friend and colleague of mine, and is involved with leadership programs connected with innovation and technology. So he'll tell us a little bit more about that. But he's also a serial entrepreneur and just generally someone who's got lots of interesting things to say. And as always, Britt and Ian are joining us. As we've always said at the beginning of these, if you want to join in the conversation, please do. You can see the links on LinkedIn. You can join us live. You can challenge what we're saying. You can ask questions. You know, the more that view, the more that watch, the more that take part, the better, because this is what Let's Talk Leadership is all about. We're going to be having a conversation this morning around the challenges, the specific challenges facing younger people who are starting off their leadership careers, whether they're based in rural areas or whether they're just moving into industry for the first time or moving into sectors perhaps they haven't worked in before. And what we feel are perhaps some of the challenges that we see they're facing. And then we're going to share these with some of the very people that we're talking about on a future conversation. So I think probably what's best to do is just to kick off by briefly asking, Jane, can you tell us a little bit about the Rural Youth Project? What, you know, the connections you have and what you're trying to do?
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Thanks ever so much for inviting me this morning. So yeah, I was just saying to all of us before we started that we started up, my colleague Rebecca Dawes and I started up the Rural Youth Project probably about 3.5 years ago. And it was driven by concern that everywhere we go in the world, so not just here in the UK, there's an endemic problem of young people leaving rural areas, and with them goes their energy, their ideas, their ability to change and adapt and change place, and also importantly the loss of services that go with young people, particularly schools. So I'm very involved with the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists, so travel a lot and spent a lot of time in my upbringing overseas, and this problem is everywhere. So we decided to start researching young people to find out what the issues were, looking at everything from connectivity, housing, skills, earnings, social life, mental health. And it kind of escalated into this big thing. Lots of people were interested in the sentiments of young people, and very little research had been done. So what we've done now is the project is very much focused on building activism, leadership and enterprise skills, but we do it in a very creative way. So we gather stories from around the world of communities or young people that have done things differently. We run ideas festivals, which are super inspiring. So music, food, inspiring young speakers. We run education training, ideas cafes. So kind of everything that's steeped in encouraging young people to be more confident and to build their skills.
Great, and you have international connections, don't you? So although it's Rural Youth Project sort of based in Scotland, you have connections around the world with different organisations.
Yeah, we are international, and prior to the lockdown we were talking about running ideas festivals with a couple of partners in Australia. We're talking about doing a similar thing in the US. So these international organizations recognize the lack of knowledge and the need.
Yeah. And Saffy, perhaps slightly differently, but in the same context, you're working with people who perhaps have been through university, so they've got so far with where they want to get to, and then your whole remit is to help them move into roles in a range of companies that are not just fresh produce and food, but wider than that as well. So tell us a little bit about what you see as the challenges and what MDS does to help them.
Saffy, you're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I wonder when it'll be that we don't hear those words. You're on mute. I don't think they're ever going to end, are they? I think one of the main challenges for young people that we see, they come in to MDS and they don't really know what they want to do. So they've had all the theoretical experience, but they haven't had any practical. And so they've done really well in their degree subject, and that might have nothing to do with the food or fresh produce industry, because we pride ourselves that actually we take all degree disciplines, but then they don't know where they fit. They don't know the company culture. They don't know where they're going to be able to shine. They don't know what they're not good at either. So I think that's one of the big challenges, that is, how do I know where I'm going to fit? How do I know what is going to be my future career, and where can I really show my true potential? And a program like MDS hopefully helps them to find that. But then when you think we've only got nearing 80 trainees, but all of the how do young people generally find the career that they want to go into for the rest of their lives? I mean, they've made decisions at 18 about what they're going to do, what subject they're going to choose. And I don't know about anybody else, but I thought I knew everything at 18 and have discovered I knew nothing. And I think that's the same for most people. So they make all of these decisions, and then they're forced down a route where they're not able to really show their true potential and find what they're passionate about or what they really want to do for the rest of their lives.
And just in terms of the scale of this, I mean, MDS has grown. I mean, Jim and I will know that MDS grew from a small training group in Lincolnshire, but you're now a substantial organisation, aren't you? But you are a not-for-profit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It is just about training and developing young people.
Yeah. And how many people would you be supporting over the 2 years?
Currently, I think we're on 75 trainees.
Yeah.
And we're just 63 member companies. There's a lot of businesses now involved.
Gosh, ranging from producers to retailers and everything in between.
Everything in between, yeah.
Great. And Jim, we met years and years ago, and you've helped with your son set up a very successful brewery business. And you've been working all over the world with sort of different organizations. Any reflections you've got on what you've noticed, in particular, the challenges facing young people?
Yeah, it was occurring to me as Saffy was talking, actually, that what is young? And we talk about young leaders. Is it an age like under 40, under 30? But I guess in a sense it doesn't matter, because we're talking about new leaders coming into an environment which is challenging, where they may not be clear about what the leadership behaviors are needed are. I've been involved with a really interesting organization called BNP Paribas for the last 10 years. It's a French bank, but it's global. It's big in Asia. And I spent a lot of time in Asia working with large groups of young people coming in, who were destined to be leaders of the company, those that stayed and persevered in the organization. And one thing that struck me was exactly as Saffy says, they made a decision at the age of 18. They've gone into university to study finance or history or whatever. And they're in that groove of this is what I am doing, and it's almost like they're tramlined then into a certain form of career or position that they really are sort of quite restrained and constrained into, and finding themselves and finding and discovering what leadership is for them is quite tricky. So we ran a lot of programs which helped them reflect upon who they were, help them explore relationships, and help them understand what leadership was all about. And one thing for me was that for many people, leadership is quite an abstract term. It's a fluffy thing of, is it charisma? Is it how handsome you are? How beautiful you are? What is it? And one thing that I found really useful was helping people recognize that it was about behavior, that it was actions that you took which allowed you to be a leader or not. And that's one thing for me. I don't know if that answers your question, Matthew, but that's just a few reflections.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because we have, I mean, I've forgotten, this is something like our 50th either recorded or live conversation over the last 16 months, and we've explored leadership in all sorts of shapes, sizes and forms. And I know that, well, I'll let Britt and Ian sort of chip in with what we believe leadership is all about. But I don't know, Ian, Britt, do you want to sort of have a stab at what we think leadership is all about?
How long do we have, Matthew? No, I thank you so much to Saffy, Jane and Jim, just to trigger some thoughts in my mind, some reflections. But no, absolutely, with leadership, it's a lifelong study of human behavior, really. In my opinion, it's whether you're young, mid-career as a leader, or maybe you're mentoring others because you've got so much wisdom and experience, probably of how not to do things, which is what the older I get, the more I realise, not so much the mistakes, but the learnings that I've had along the way, some rich learnings. But I'd just love to go back to the whole idea. There was an activism, I think it was leadership, but the activism for younger people to really, take hold of some very important topics and bring them to life, and that any one person can do that. We see this a lot, don't we, in the media right now. But to create that willingness to take a stand and to do something could be another angle on leadership. You want people to have an opinion, a point of view, and then to be a catalyst to get stuff done. And I'm always thinking of a certain young Swedish lady who we all know and most of us love. I think she can be polarizing to some, but Greta Thunberg and people like her who just show that one person can make a huge difference in the conversations of what's important to discuss. And I think we often lose sight of what's important these days. And I love listening to the younger leaders or the younger people just to keep real on what's important for the world that we're leaving behind for people in whichever industry we're involved with. So I love any organization that's helping people have a voice. So I'd love to be more involved with some of those conversations.
Britt, any thoughts?
Yes, and thank you, thanks to all of you, but also thank you, Jim, for pointing out again, which something which we've found time and time again, which is that leadership is about behavior and actions, just to build also on what Ian said. And many young people, I think, don't realize that the actions they take and the behavior that they choose, because behavior is a choice very often, as long as you're aware of it, is about taking leadership. And in the example of, I think, Greta Thunberg, even though it's becoming a bit of a tired example maybe, but it's still such a very powerful example. She didn't sit down during her first strike, her first school strike, thinking, I'm going to be a leader and I'm going to have the opportunity to go across the Atlantic and actually snub the president of the US. She wasn't thinking about that. But the behavior, her anger, her drive, her passion to do something, even as small as it was, and that turned out to be a huge thing, that was leadership. That was leadership. And I think a lot of young people maybe sometimes misunderstand the term leadership. And you said, Jim, it's sometimes vague, and it is, and it's certainly not something that is the prerogative of the senior people with the corner office. Not at all. It starts very young, and if we can get the more young people we can get to understand that it starts with them very young, I think that's our contribution that we can make.
And interesting. Sorry, I'm not on mute, so I can talk, I hope. I think the example of Greta Thunberg is so relevant, because what she shows for me is courage. That she has the courage, even though she's a very vulnerable young woman, she has such courage. And that's one thing that does differentiate a a leader from a brilliant leader, somebody who has the courage to do and say what needs to be said.
Yeah, and Jane, given that you're working with young people who are in rural areas, what are I can think of all sorts of challenges that all of us would face starting our leadership careers, or starting a career that brings us into that leadership role. What specifically are some of the challenges in rural areas that you've identified? Because lots of bright people living in rural areas, lots of young people living in rural areas, lots of young people who are motivated, but the rural element, what is the challenge there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a very complex, as you can imagine, extremely complex. I think the biggest word that sums up what young people don't have in rural areas typically is opportunity. Quite often you find young people with portfolio of jobs. They're not careers, they're ways of earning money. And for them, the thought that they can be a leader in their community is very, very difficult for them. In our survey work, we've found that only 13% of young people feel they have a say in their community. So if you don't have a say, how can you start to even imagine that you can lead change in that place? But there are some communities. We had an LGBTQ session this week, an Ideas Cafe. And there's a young guy from Hoy. It's a population of 400 in Orkney. And he's been really well accepted in his community, grown up there, and that's unusual that he has been accepted. So acceptance is an important part of opportunity. If people accept you, they love you and they want to embrace you, then you're in a nurturing environment to develop your leadership skills and to be able to do what Greta has done. Often in those places that young people have been brought up, they may have gone away to uni and returned, but they're still viewed as a little girl who rides around on her pony with plaits in her hair, whereas she's 22 now and she's got purpose and she's got things she wants to do. And I think the other challenge of rural places is that we've found that over 80% of young people live where they do through emotional connections. So that'll be family, a family business, or it'll be their partners. And that is great if it's a nurturing environment, but if it isn't, that can be incredibly stifling for young people. So they've got all of these layers, and that's before you get into the issues of housing, where they live. So they're still living with their parents in the family business. There's all sorts of layers beneath that. But I think the biggest issue for young people in rural areas is lack of opportunity. One of the areas of research we're going to be doing this coming year is that we've repeatedly found that where that young people are working for a cool business in rural areas, that a business that's underpinned by values, that has a strong brand identity, that has flexible working, they will forego income. They'll suffer poorer housing. They will cycle to work for 6 miles because it's a cool business. So we really want to understand what cool is in rural and what businesses can do to become more cool to attract and retain young people. And
Saffy, are you noticing that with, I would suggest and challenge me on this, that really the real benefit that MDS provides the young people that you support is almost not so much the content or the elements of the experience, but just that 2 years of opportunity to really think about what they want to do and develop as individuals and sort of grow to a point where they can start to make decisions that, if you like, are more informed because they've been involved directly in making them, rather than feeling they've been sort of pushed down a particular route. Have you noticed a difference in people leaving MDS and saying, well, I want to work for a company with the sort of values that Jane's been talking about?
Oh, definitely. I would say that young people coming into MDS are strong. They won't accept anything but what their beliefs are. So values, ethics, sustainability, it's all really high on their agenda. So they come in and they already know what they want, and they won't tolerate anything else. So they're working with it. I think the challenges they have are that the people that are in charge, the older generation. So Gen Z are coming in, and it isn't a struggle for them. They already won't accept any inequality. You know, they've got a really sensible forethought, but they're working with people that maybe haven't got there yet. So we're working towards it, and that's the struggle. So we have trainees that come to us and say, you know, I'm not prepared to work these ridiculous hours. You'll all remember this from historical MDS. You know, in the industry, you start work when the light comes up and you don't stop until it goes down. When people are now saying, no, that's not acceptable. You know, we need a work-life balance. There are no differences with gender. Females that come into MDS get as much opportunity as the males do. But what the trouble is the people that are in charge still, they're the ones that we need to change the attitudes of. And the young people now, I think, are the ones that are driving that. So they're driving the ones in charge. And it's really interesting. It is all about values, and it is about opportunity and not accepting anything that isn't fair. Yeah. And I'm really fascinated by it, because I keep thinking, well, why do we still have these issues? And it is because of the generations that want to change, but it's so deeply embedded. They think they've changed, but actually they've still got an awful long way to go. And it's those battles, and it's the ones coming up that are making it happen.
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, we did a recording with Laura Liswood, who is an American lady who's done a lot of work in diversity and inclusion and speaks at international conferences and things. And in the book that she wrote, one of the chapters is called "Don't Bring Your Grandmother to Work," and it's this whole piece about however hard we try to change ourselves, Granny is still sitting on our shoulder. In fact, you know, I even had a conversation with a friend of mine this morning while walking the dog about trying to encourage our grandchildren to eat food, you know, and I was saying it's stupid. I was told to just get on and eat my vegetables when I was young. You know, why the hell does my grandson now play up about eating green vegetables? She said, well, because, you know, times have moved on, Matthew. Don't be the grandmother, you know, try and make it more exciting. And you're right. There is this, however hard we try, to a certain extent, we are, even though we think we're being as sort of open and as inclusive and as unbiased as we can be, it's still there. It still sits there. I mean, Britt, Ian, we see this all the time, don't we? In the world.
Do. Yeah, we do. And some of it is, I think, people, more senior people, stuck in more conservative mindsets, possibly. And sometimes it's also fear. I have coached more than one senior leader who actually has the courage to admit that, well, if we let all these youngsters come in, then where will our jobs be? And because we all live longer, and we live longer in a healthy state, and we all need our pensions, and pensions are ever more expensive. This is not at all to find excuses or to say that I think it's a good thing. But there's just like the youth in rural areas, there are more layers also for the reasons for which more senior people are sometimes reluctant, either by choice or by ignorance, or simply by fear. What's this? What are they going to do? You know, they're already much better technologically. They have iPhones. They've got all these gadgets. They've got all these things. They think fast. What's that going to do to my job? And my salary, of course, by extension.
There's a vulnerability there, isn't there, Britt? I mean, it reminds me of when my children, particularly my son, because I remember I'm old enough to remember before we had computers, and then when the first computers came out, and we had the computer at school, and we were allowed to take it home like the gerbil for the weekend. So I had the computer one weekend. Yeah. And of course, my dad, because he was involved with some technology and aircraft systems, he knew a bit about stuff. So we were kind of on a par at that point. But then when I got my own computer as I was older, it wasn't long before I could beat my dad at the games. And then at that point, the minute I started to beat him, he was long gone, because I just, you know, my ability. Same happened to me with my son when he had his first PlayStation, the same thing. And you realize as a parent that your kids will outgrow your ability so quick as the technologies and things move on. But we see it in office and business life through our work, don't we, Britt? And I remember I was in Michigan, of all places, Plymouth, on the outskirts of Detroit, and we had a big company, and we were working with the execs and senior leaders, and we had the ability to one evening align with a trainee program that was running in parallel. and the trainees were just presenting their project progress, and the energy, the passion, the inspiration. I was just sat there thinking, wow, I wish I was training that program, not the one. I love the people on my program, but you know, I can't help them as much as these people can help me. And I'm thinking, wow, this is great. And then we did this little networking thing. We've got some trainees to come and sit with some of the senior execs, all men and women, younger and older, and the trainees and the executives. And then the next morning I said, so what did you think? Because I had my team back then again. I said, the execs, what did you think of last night? Oh, it's wonderful. And then one guy put his hand up and say, yeah, but Ian, don't worry. We'll soon knock out that energy and that ambition. We'll soon show them how the world really works. I'm thinking, oh, you know, oh, help me, you know, what can we do? And he was joking, but he wasn't joking.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even yesterday, I was on a call with a client, and they've quite a large employer, and they had done a survey about the changing attitudes to the future of work. They did something internal to try and sort of make sense of what was happening. And they said it was really interesting. Nearly all of the senior people that took part in the survey, and we're talking about a company that employs about 7,000 to 8,000 people, all of the senior people wanted everyone back in the office. Only a very, very small proportion of the younger generation of employees wanted to go back in the office more than one day a week. And although it was an internal survey, it doesn't necessarily represent what's going on in the wider world. Just on that one issue, it's just something that's arisen as a result of the pandemic. And not saying one is a good idea and one is about, just a difference of viewpoint that is huge about how we take things forward and who's going to get listened to. How are we going to make those decisions that help young people feel that they have got a leadership role and that they are going to be listened to? If, with respect, we've got the older generation, and I can comfortably say I'm certainly the oldest generation here, sort of saying, hold on a moment, you've got to be back in the office, or hold on a moment, you've got to do things like we did. It's a hugely important issue.
And I hope, Matthew, that our younger leaders, people coming through the programs that we've been hearing about today, are going to be opinionated and activist enough to create the workplace that we need for the future, for them and for us, and really push that agenda. I was talking to some friends, we had a drink last night, and we were talking about, what is office life going to be like, particularly where some of the bigger companies have a presence, say, in London, but should they have more satellite places, more in rural areas, maybe, these cooler companies that Jane was talking about? Wouldn't it be great if you could still have office time, but in a more collaborative space? A lot of the companies that offer this collaborative working spaces typically still go to the big cities. What if we didn't? What if we had smaller operations that people can come to, and then you can get cross-fertilization with different industries, different sectors coming together, but still an office environment for people to learn, to be coached, to have coffee and to discuss everything from politics, and football or whatever, just to have that connectivity that people need, and networking, of course, face-to-face networking.
I mean, Jane and Saffy are involved in, large numbers of people. I mean, I'm just reflecting on the 12 or so young people that we're currently supporting. I mean, when I think of, Fatima, who's about to join us from Somalia, who is sort of organizing football matches while bombs are going off all around her. We've got at least 4 young people in India who are looking after, 175,000 young girls playing sport, or, 250,000 rural farmers. Sophie, who's an ex-MDS trainee, who's suddenly in a role, huge responsibility for procurement in the middle of a pandemic when, getting hold of produce and making sure that staff are looked after and are cared for, huge responsibilities on very, very young shoulders. Henry, the very first, young person that we're coaching, who's now, on the air ambulance team for the south of England, and who was dispatching ambulances all through the pandemic and having to deal with the most horrendous situations, aged 25, 26. I think the latest coachee we've got, Rohit, who's based in Birmingham, running community music projects all over the West Midlands, at a time when people can't get together, and dealing with it and making it happen. Some of these challenges that the younger leaders face are huge, and yet they seem to just get on and do it. There's an energy about it. There's a willingness to just try things and do things differently, which I think is really exciting, Really exciting. Jane, how, thoughts, any sort of examples perhaps of things where you've noticed that perhaps from someone who's come from an area that maybe is fairly isolated, but has just had that sort of courage to say, right, come on, let's just get on and do something. I want to make a difference.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Sorry, there's another meeting going on. I hope it's not going to disturb anybody within the office. Yeah, lots and lots of examples, Matthew, but I think mentoring is a big part of people, giving young people the confidence and real mentoring when you know them well, you know their vulnerabilities, and you can, they're very open, they will talk about their vulnerabilities, but you need to understand them and they need to trust you before you can start delving into those. And Saffy will know that because she has many conversations like I do. But some really, it's also about helping young people formulate their ideas and getting some structure to those ideas. So I'll give you an example. We in our ideas festivals, we tend to have participative or ideation type exercises. So design thinking is a really powerful tool. And we ran one, this is just before the pandemic, and we had a whole afternoon on design thinking. And there was one young girl from Clare Island, right on the bottom, at the bottom of Ireland. So it's the most southerly point. And she told her, she had a quip of a story, which was, oh, we can't get a takeaway on the island. And so she was delighted when there was a super fast ferry that comes from the mainland to the island. And so she said, I called, she knows the harbour master. Can you ask the ferry to go and pick me up a takeaway? They're going to drop it off when they come into dock and bring it over. And she said she was delighted because she had this hot takeaway food. So we started talking about food on the island and the culture on the island. It's a very close-knit community. And we started working through this idea of, could you start a takeaway on the island? No, that's probably not going to work. But we came to the idea of a farmer's market. She's now done it. During the pandemic, she had to leave university, Trinity College, and went home, and she started this farmer's market. But she needed somebody to believe her, somebody to take an interest, a bit of fun around, this whole takeaway thing. First time she had a warm takeaway. But from it, she has developed confidence, she's developed a project, she's demonstrated leadership, and she's brought the community with her. And I think that's a really good example of courage and all of the other things in a very micro sense. But she wants to make her life on the island. So for her, it's a very important first step.
Wonderful, a great example.
Yeah, thanks. And Jim, any further thoughts?
Let me unmute myself first. Yeah, well, one thing that I was reflecting on was this issue of confidence. Somebody earlier mentioned that one of the big challenges is how do young leaders build a sense of confidence in themselves? And before the pandemic, we had the opportunity to run face-to-face programs, training programs. And I know all Saffy and Matthew and probably the rest of you have been heavily involved in experiential training, where you actually create opportunities for people to work together, and that allows them to practice the actions of leadership and build their confidence. And we don't have that now quite so easily, do we, with the pandemic? And it'd be really interesting to know how many of you have been able to find virtual opportunities of how building people's confidence, young leaders' confidence. I'm working with quite a number of people, mainly in the States, actually, young leaders who are working in fields of technology, often at very right at the sharp end of technology. One guy, for example, is working with battery technology, developing batteries for cars and other big things, aeroplanes and ships, that can charge really quickly and hold vast amounts of power. And he's at this leading edge of this, and he's only, I think it's about 32. So I would classify him as young. But he's running into the problems of confidence, that he is coming up against people who are still they're relatively young, maybe in their 40s, who consciously or otherwise are keeping him down, preventing him from exploring some ideas that he'd like to do. And I'd be really interested to know if anyone has had experience of how do you help people build confidence virtually. We could do it face to face. I think we were good at it, but how do we do it virtually?
We have, Saffy's probably got similar experiences, but there's real value in having a cohort of people together. So we've done some change making training during lockdown, and it was really important time for them to come together. So we did have, that was one of the upsides of lockdown, that we could bring those people together. But when you've got a cohort, and that doesn't necessarily need to be young people who know one another, it's shared interests. Bringing them together on the climate agenda, for example, so very, very quickly the barriers break down and they start to have a conversation. So I think it's really important having like-minded people. I mentioned that we had an LGBTQ ideas cafe earlier this week. We had nearly 30 people join when the sun was shining, and the debate, everybody stayed on for the whole time. We live streamed it, so it was being watched on Facebook. But because it was a topic that they were all interested in, and there were some very vulnerable people on that call because we know them. But the honesty with these, and that's the other lovely thing about young people, they're so honest. And the guy from Orkney that I mentioned earlier, he was so articulate about talking about what he's going through, and there's real value in that. So a unifying topic and a cohort that wants to talk about it.
Yeah, I would agree, because we obviously train everybody in cohorts, and we've had to do that virtually. When I think back now, we've recruited our third group that we haven't actually met. So we've recruited them, they've joined MDS, and they're now going into their third secondments, and they've not met any of their colleagues, but they are all working together because we have done things to help them to bond. So we did like escape rooms, virtual escape rooms, and quizzes, and some of the fun things, so that they feel comfortable as a group, so that they can support each other. And then as much as possible, you can train them still virtually, and give them the skills and give them exercises to do as a coerced group. I can't deny that it's better face to face. I absolutely believe it is, but I think it's possible to do it virtually, and you can develop those skills like confidence and resilience, and some of the ones that continue to be a challenge.
And I remember a long time ago, sorry Jen to interrupt, that I was working with a client, and these were somewhere in the mid-level of maturity of leaders, and they were doing a task. It was a face-to-face program, doing a task, and they were clearly going to fail in the achievement of the task in the time duration. And the client, who was our client and the superior person there for the business, had a real issue with the fact they were not going to succeed in the task. So much so that when I turned my back, they actually gave them some extra time just to make sure they finished it. And I was saying, why would you do that? Because courage comes from success, but also failure. You have to allow people to attempt something like setting up a takeaway on an island that clearly is not going to work, but maybe drones are the answer, who knows? But maybe there's another idea in the future. But no, you need to try things and learn, and then try something else and learn. And however you regard failure, courage typically comes from trying things, having setbacks, and doing something different. And I think we can do that virtually as well. It's not as easy, Saffy, I do agree.
Yeah.
But any experience where you actually do not achieve the ultimate aim is a wonderful learning experience if it's well facilitated, and the people themselves, the culture around it, enable that to be okay and actually be part of the learning, be intentional almost. Yeah, but not in a negative way, in a very positive way.
I noticed that Asha Ghosh, who's one of the people who follows us, I think she's based in the States, and she's mentioned this thing about empowering young people to recognize their own abilities, small cross-silo teams. One of the things that I think does work hugely well in the virtual world, as long as everyone's got the connectivity, is I've been running some peer learning sets. So small groups of people from different parts of an organization coming together for a couple of hours, sometimes facilitated, sometimes self-facilitated, just talking about things that are going on in their part of the business or going on in their lives, and just sharing those experiences. And I had one yesterday with 4 people. I'm not going to say they're young people because, well, some of them are young, but not in any way. It's certainly younger than me. But they'd all got similar experiences where they started off talking about their own challenges. And when you listened carefully to what they were saying, underlying all of it was some common themes. And as soon as they hit on the fact that there were some common themes, the conversation just took off. And for about an hour, they were just saying, well, have you tried this? What about that? I could help you with that. Or, you know, had you thought about doing this? And I think that in the virtual world, the building confidence to deal with issues, having that opportunity to bring people together and just to talk is really, really important. And again, going back to the rural issue, the virtual world helps, presumably, Jane, because you can connect a young person on Clare Island with someone in the Orkneys and get those connections going, even if the opportunities for them to actually meet face to face are very small indeed.
Yeah, and it's also about how you facilitate those sessions. You know, if you're full of energy and positivity and you build people up, so you know all of them are going to come in lacking confidence, even the ones that are speaking. So if you are disarming and fun and you bring people in, and so the facilitator is really important as well. And it doesn't have to be a young person, although it does help. So we did some facilitating training during lockdown to engage some of the more active members of our network, and we got them doing it. So that was great, and they came up with the topic. They thought about the people that they wanted. They came up with the content for social media, so they felt an ownership, and that was really powerful. But also older people, you know, all of us on this call, we may be older, but we have a very young energy about us, and I think it's bringing those people. You don't want somebody dull leading that kind of event. So I think you can make it work, but like Saffy, it doesn't beat face to face.
No. And Britt, I'm trying to remember what's the name of that 100? I'm going to call it the 100 Club. That's not the right term, but the forum in Holland.
Yes, gosh. Yes. It's something like 100 Club, and because we interviewed some young Dutch entrepreneurs. They're part of that, and it is a club where I think you need to nominate, as a young leader, you need to nominate somebody else, and you are part of a forum for a year, which is all about knowledge sharing and exchange, and it seems to work very, very well. I must admit, I don't know that much about it, not the ins and outs, but I've heard that it works really well. And I just want to pick up on the chat where Jane said that you make the remark about intergenerational learning as being really important. And you say that prior to lockdown, you ran learning journeys. So that's probably something which was developed to be a similar thing, where you learn from each other, not just as young people, but also people from other generations. And you give a compliment to the Netherlands, where you say that you spent a week in the Netherlands looking at what the Dutch do so well: innovation, urban-rural connection, and circularity. And I think maybe part of the reason why we are good at that is the size of the country. We're a smaller country. I think in a larger country, rural areas are larger. Simply, the geography makes it more difficult, I think, to make connections. We have virtually no rural space left. That's the downside of Holland. But yes, I'm not sure what else we could do, but I think it would be a great idea if we could forge some connections, maybe also between countries, and find young leaders who are in a similar position. And then maybe, you know, I'm just sort of generating ideas, do something in terms of Let's Talk Leadership, where we could take this further and learn from each other also across borders.
Definitely, Britt. I mean, it was a phenomenal trip. So I co-organized it with a young Dutch guy, 25. He went to Eindhoven University and studied agriculture and entrepreneurship. And he has now built a business on the back of doing trips like this. So we took some older rural leaders from Scotland, and we took some people from our network, and we went to see some of the most amazing businesses. And every single person on that trip still talks about the huge innovation. Just you guys think so differently. I think everybody needs some time in the Netherlands to see how you think, how you do. You're bold, you're courageous as a nation, you're collaborative. And some of those businesses that we went to see, the floating dairy farm, we went to see growing place, hydroponic growing systems in an old disused Philips building. You know, just you're so innovative about space and about how to do things. But bringing those older and younger people together was really disarming, because everybody was working hard. We had very long days intentionally. They had to eat together. They had to share accommodation, you know, so we intended to make it uncomfortable, but also comforting. And it was just we are definitely going to be doing more. We'd love to do some with you. We've got a trip we're planning to Finland, actually, because the Finns, 50% of them live rurally, and the Finns are super collaborative, and very community-led. Local development is a big thing that the Finns do. So we're planning on taking a trip to Finland at some point to see how they develop people and leaders and community.
Great.
I guess the sad thing, Jane, is that much of that opportunity also exists in our own communities as well, and yet we don't see it. It's more obvious when you go and do more of a cultural walkabout in different countries where the whole culture has a different essence. But I think we've also got opportunities in our own backyard that we're missing because we don't know what's going on. And going back to the mentoring thing, I think the other benefit of having those relationships between the younger and the older generations is to flip the role of the mentor and the mentee to do reverse mentoring. And that would really hopefully overcome the challenge that I experienced back in Michigan, when actually that's the intention of this. We want the children, not the but the younger generation to be in charge and to see what would really happen, because we may break down some silos and some historical beliefs about how the future of business should be run, whatever industry that you're in. So going back to activism maybe, but I think there's a huge opportunity there.
And I think this whole idea of sharing an experience is really important. And I think it also reflects on organizations when they say yes when you ask them about something, as opposed to saying, oh, it's a bit difficult. And I mean, I'm going to mention one just because Saffy will know them. I reached out to G's Fresh, to Beverly Dixon, who's the group HR director, to ask if possibly I could take a group of people to visit G's later this year or early into the new year. And I did it basically thinking, is this, am I going to get anywhere with this? And when you get a response back that says, we would be delighted to, we'll get our HR people in from Spain, we'll organize a trip around the producing sites, you just tell us when you want to come. Yes, there are COVID issues, but we can do it. Your heart leaps because you think, yeah, that's the sort of attitude. So taking young people, I mean, in this case, they're going to be older people, but taking younger people to interesting experiences where they have a chance to contribute and they have a chance to meet people who are doing things differently, so they can see there is a future for challenge. There is a future for, saying, actually, we don't want to do it like this any longer. We want to do it differently, is hugely important. And so I think reaching out to EDF is another one that I'm doing the same thing with, reaching out to organizations where the answer is often yes, rather than no, it's too much hassle, is hugely important in making the sort of thing that, Jane, you've been talking about come about. Finding these organizations and people who are prepared to share their creative ideas, their opportunities, and just get people thinking differently about stuff. And I think we can all contribute to that. I mean, that's what we're trying to do at Let's Talk Leadership in a very small way, starting off in a small way. The three of us are actually quite surprised that we're still doing this, based on our sort of early conversations about where this might go. But there's a lot to be said about building networks that are creative, innovative, and you can do it virtually. I mean, the big advantage is you can reach out to someone in Papua New Guinea and say, would you be free next Friday for a morning talk, and get connected with people, which you can't do physically. But I think, Jim, you're right. I think we've all struggled. I mean, Ian and Britt in particular have been quite creative in doing experiential stuff virtually. I know Ian has in particular, particularly to do with change. It is possible to do it, but when you do get back to face-to-face, it's also fun.
And you have to be more creative, and I think that's the thing. But it's also been a challenge for people like us, because to embrace a fully, I think the last time that I travelled for a face-to-face program was March last year, and those people that quickly adapted to that new setting and were creative with the tools, and the tools have come on a long way since then as well. But some didn't. Some believed that no, the face-to-face will come back really quickly, and of course it never did. And in the future, we don't know the mix in the future, but yeah, that willingness to try things out and be creative, and maybe not all of them worked particularly well. I love the term experimentation, because that's a great excuse when it doesn't quite turn out the way you'd like it. It's just an experiment. That's okay. But no, pioneering is one of my favorite words, and I think that's the thing that we should do. But we need opportunity. I think, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, you can have the willingness to create opportunities, and you can have the courage to go and seize them, but we, people that can, have to create them, have to create an environment where people have opportunity. And that's why I'm really inspired by the work that our three guests are involved with here, because without that, you close down the opportunity, and it's really, containing for people. And the pandemic is not an excuse, and the virtual working is not an excuse. You can still create opportunity and do a virtual cultural walkabout, for example. So I've gone all around the world in the last year without leaving this office. So yeah, but it's not the same. It's not the same.
No. I think perhaps we ought to leave the conversation on that very positive note. But can I say to those who may have been listening and watching, then do keep adding your comments and continue to keep in touch with us. And if you've got ideas for future conversations, that would be wonderful to hear from you. Jane, thanks for giving up your time this morning. Saffy, the same to you, because I know you're both very busy. Jim, you need to get back to your family commitments, but thanks for joining us, and good luck when you're back in France. And Brittany, Ian, as always, super to see you. And if you have been watching, thank you very much indeed. And if you haven't, then switch in at some point and watch it at your leisure. Great, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you.